Granite Hollow was a town that rarely had time for outsiders. Nestled between jagged peaks and the unforgiving winds of the highlands, it had been built by men who fought nature for every inch of land. They lived by a simple rule: you either make it here or you don't. The townspeople were proud of their struggle, their resilience, and the weight of the rough, timbered homes they'd built with their own hands. But in the shadow of the towering ridges, one woman's presence defied everything they thought they knew about survival. Her name was Min. The people of Granite Hollow didn't call her by name, they simply called her the widow, though she had been a widow for many years now. Min lived alone at the edge of town, not in a house like the rest, but in the belly of a mountain itself, where she had made her home inside the abandoned Copperhead Drift, a long-forgotten mine shaft, now silent except for the whispers of the earth that pulsed through it. The town had its suspicions about her, but none dared to voice them too loudly. They were kind in their own way to her, often nodding politely as she passed. But they saw her as odd and pitying, not understanding how a woman could choose to live in a dark, damp hole instead of among them in the warmth of a fire-lit cabin. In truth, they were uncomfortable with her presence. After all, who would want to live like that? In the shadows, away from civilization, away from light. The women, lounging on their porches, would smile at each other behind their lace handkerchiefs and whisper about her. They said it wasn't proper for a woman to live like that it was Christian. "She's gone mad with grief," they'd say, as Min, dressed in a faded gray prairie dress, would trek into town carrying sacks of flour or oil, her figure hunched under the weight. They made jokes behind her back, too. "Living like a bat in a cave," one of the men would laugh. "I don't know what she's trying to prove." Min didn't care for their words. She didn't let them see her react. Her face remained a mask of quiet resilience, even as they laughed, even as they mocked. She didn't answer their taunts. She simply walked on, her boots crunching in the dry dirt, carrying what she needed back to her sanctuary beneath the mountain. But the truth was that Min knew something they didn't. Her home was not just a place of despair, as the others imagined. It was a safe haven, a carefully constructed fortress. The Copperhead Drift, though abandoned by miners, still breathed with the pulse of the earth. It was warm in the winter, cool in the summer, a perfect balance, one she had learned from her late husband, Chin. He had been the one to teach her how to listen to the mountain, to feel its rhythm, to understand its subtle signs. Before he had died from the terrible mine fever, he had taught her how to seal cracks with clay and straw, how to trap heat and maintain the airflow. It was an art, one that the townspeople had long since forgotten. While they worked with wood and glass, Min worked with the stone, crafting a home that would last longer than any wooden house they had ever built. Every day, Min would climb to the mine to tend to her sanctuary. It wasn't much: a small iron stove for warmth, shelves stocked with carefully preserved food, a bed made of straw and thick blankets. The cold never reached her here. The mountain held its warmth, wrapped around her like a cloak. She knew what the others didn't. While their houses were vulnerable to the shifting whims of the weather, her cave was built to endure. As the fall season began to settle in, the whispers from the town grew louder. The men were building new homes, fresh and green, with no knowledge of the winter that was coming. "More wood will keep us warm," they said. But Min saw the signs: the squirrels were disappearing, the geese were flying erratically. The air tasted metallic, like the calm before a storm. One day, as she trudged up the mountain carrying a heavy load of clay for her airlock, she encountered Gabriel, the town's wheelwright. He wasn't like the others. He didn't laugh at her or mock her home. Instead, he nodded to her with a quiet respect that made her pause. "The frost is deep this year," he said, looking at her burden. "The wood down there, it's already starting to warp." Min glanced at him, her gaze sharp. "Stone does not shrink," she said, the words coming out steady and sure. "It only waits." Gabriel looked at her for a long moment, as if considering her words. He didn't offer to help her with the load, but instead nodded again. "Be safe up there," he said, tipping his hat and turning back toward town. Min didn't respond. She didn't need to. She already knew what the mountain would do. The rest of them didn't. But soon everyone would learn. 3 days later, the sky above Granite Hollow turned an unnatural shade of purple. The air shifted in an alarming way, and the pressure dropped so quickly that the livestock in the valley began to panic. The wind howled like an animal in agony, and the first flakes of snow began to fall, but they weren't soft, gentle flakes. They were hard, sharp, and driven by a vicious wind that tore across the land like a hunter's arrow. Min could feel it coming before it reached her, and when it did, she moved quickly. She sealed her doors, checked the vents, and fired up the stove with the coal she had stored from the deeper parts of the mine. She prepared herself for what was to come. She had done this before. Meanwhile, down in the valley, Granite Hollow was unraveling. As the storm raged outside, the town's wooden houses began to give way. The green lumber cracked and popped as the cold forced it to shrink. The roofs collapsed, windows shattered. The families huddled inside, shivering, with fires sputtering out as the chimneys clogged with snow and wind. But Min wasn't worried about her house. She wasn't worried about her survival. She had prepared for this. And she knew that when the time came, the town would come to her. And they did. As the night grew colder, the winds howling louder, Min knew that this storm would not just be another winter's blizzard. It would be the test of everything she had worked for. And when the people of Granite. The wind screamed outside Min's shelter, a relentless force that shook the mountain as if it were a mere toy in nature's hands. The air pressure dropped so quickly that it felt like the very earth was being sucked away, taking the warmth with it. In the valley below, Granite Hollow had become a battlefield against the snowstorm's fury. The once lively streets were now eerily silent, save for the howl of the wind. Inside the town, the homes were quickly succumbing to the elements. The green timber that had been freshly built, meant to withstand the weight of the previous winters, now cracked and groaned as the freezing temperatures squeezed the moisture out of the wood. Roofs caved in, windows shattered under the pressure, and the town's fragile infrastructure began to disintegrate, piece by piece. The people of Granite Hollow had no choice but to huddle together in the saloon, the only building that had any semblance of sturdiness. Even there, the fire struggled against the overwhelming cold, as the downdraft caused the chimney to block, forcing the smoke to billow back into the rooms. The stench of burning wood filled the air, mixing with the scent of fear that began to take root among the survivors. Gabriel stood by the window of his workshop, watching the storm with wide, fearful eyes. He had seen enough storms in his life to know when something was different. This was no ordinary snowstorm. The snow wasn't falling gently from the sky, but was instead being driven horizontally by a fierce wind that tore through the town like an animal hunting its prey. The townspeople, trapped inside their homes, could do nothing but wait, huddling around the small flames that barely kept the chill at bay. Gabriel's breath hung in the air like a cloud, his own body stiffening with the bitter cold. He couldn't help but think of the woman who lived high above them, out there in the mountain in the mine. The woman they had all mocked, the widow Min. The woman who lived in a cave like some kind of bat, like a creature of the earth, while they had lived in their warm, wooden houses. He thought about her quiet resilience, her strange ways, and how, despite their mockery, she had always been the one who had seemed unshaken, steady, and prepared. And now, in the midst of this terrible storm, Gabriel realized what he had known all along. Min was the one who had always been ready for a storm like this. Without a second thought, he grabbed his heavy coat, bundled himself against the cold, and pushed open the door to face the violent whiteout. The storm struck him with the force of a battering ram. He could hardly see, the swirling snow and ice cutting into his skin. He kept his eyes fixed on the ridge where Min's home lay. There, faintly visible through the blinding snow, was the orange glow of her mind's thermal vents, a warm light in a sea of white. She was still alive. Min's light was the only thing that seemed real in the chaos of the storm, and it beckoned to Gabriel with the hope of salvation. His heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled through the storm, the cold seeping through his bones. Every step felt like a battle against the storm, and yet he knew he couldn't stop. The town needed Min. The children, the elderly, the people who had once laughed at her, they needed her now more than ever. The wind roared, whipping at his face, stinging his skin like 1,000 needles. His lantern was a weak flame in the storm's fury, flickering in the air before almost being blown out by the gale. The cold was so intense that Gabriel's breath formed ice crystals in the air with every exhale. He stumbled, his feet slipping beneath him as the snow grew deeper and deeper, his gloves soaked with the freezing slush. The mountain, it seemed, was doing everything it could to stop him, but still he pressed forward. He had no other choice. When he finally reached the foot of the Copperhead Drift, he could barely feel his fingers. The mountain loomed above him, an impenetrable wall of stone and snow. He reached out, pounding on the heavy timber door with his numb fists, the wind howling so loudly that his shouts were consumed by its fury. For a moment he thought he might be lost to the storm, too, that the mountain, like the rest of the world, might be indifferent to his plight. But then, just when he was about to give in, there came the sound, the unmistakable clink of the heavy bar lifting on the other side. The door cracked open, and there she was, standing in the warm glow of the mine. Min. Her gray dress was covered in dust, but there was no hint of the frailty that the others saw in her. She was strong, solid, unshakable, a woman who had not just survived but had thrived in the very heart of the mountain. Gabriel collapsed in the doorway, gasping for breath. His limbs were frozen, his lungs burning with each inhale. But Min didn't ask him what he was doing here or why he had come. She didn't need to, she knew. Without a word, she grabbed his arm and pulled him inside, her strength evident in the way she guided him through the storm into the warmth of the mountain. Once inside, she closed the door behind him, sealing them off from the chaos outside. Gabriel staggered to a bench by the stove, his body shaking with cold. The heat from the fire was immediate, seeping into his bones, but it wasn't just the warmth of the stove that he felt. It was the calm that had always surrounded Min, the sense that in this space they were safe. They were home. "The town," Gabriel rasped, struggling to speak. "The roofs are caving in. The children, they won't make it through the night." Min's eyes, dark and unreadable, met his. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, without a trace of emotion in her voice, she spoke. "The lower drift is dry," she said. "It holds the heat well, but they must walk. We cannot carry them. Will you help me, Gabriel?" She didn't ask for his pity. She didn't ask for his admiration. She simply offered a plan, a way forward, and in that moment Gabriel realized the truth. Min had always been the one who had the strength to guide them, to lead them when they couldn't lead themselves. He nodded, even as exhaustion began to pull at him, and he understood. The storm wasn't just going to test them. It was going to change everything. The silence that followed Min's words seemed heavier than the storm outside. Gabriel, his breath shallow and his limbs still frozen from the battle with the snow, watched as she moved with quiet precision, gathering supplies, preparing for something neither of them had been certain of until now, a dangerous, desperate journey through the heart of the storm. Min didn't waste words. She simply moved, a presence that seemed as sure and steadfast as the mountain itself. She was already grabbing the heavy hemp rope, coiling it expertly in her hands, the lantern she'd lit casting a soft glow on her face. Her eyes, dark and steady, never left Gabriel, though he wasn't sure if it was because she was focused on him or because she was preparing for what was to come. Whatever the reason, the town needed more than warmth. They needed to survive the storm, and that would take more than shelter. Min didn't hesitate. She wrapped the rope around herself and handed Gabriel one end of it. The town was trapped, but they wouldn't stay there for long. She would lead them out of the hellish cold, but it wouldn't be easy. "You must stay close," Min said, her voice low but full of a quiet strength. "If you fall, if you lose the rope, the mountain takes you." Gabriel nodded, though his body felt heavy and his limbs still shook with the cold. He tried to steel himself, but even with the warmth from the stove still lingering in his skin, he knew the worst was yet to come. The wind outside howled louder than ever, and Min didn't wait for him to gather his bearings. With one swift motion, she opened the inner door of the mine, revealing the darkness and the swirling snow beyond. The moment they stepped out of the mine, the full fury of the storm hit them with a violent force. The air was so thick with snow that Gabriel could barely see Min's silhouette in front of him. The winds tore through his clothing, cutting through the layers of fabric like a knife, while the snow stung his face and eyes. The cold was unlike anything he'd ever felt before, a biting force that numbed the tips of his fingers, his nose, his entire body. It wasn't just the weather. It was the very feeling of death pressing against his chest. But Min didn't falter. She moved with confidence, her boots crunching against the snow, the rope tied securely between them. Gabriel followed closely behind, trying to keep his footing on the icy path. Every step he took felt like a struggle, his body betraying him with each inch he fought forward. The climb down into Granite Hollow was grueling. Min was sure-footed, almost as if the snow didn't bother her at all. She moved like a mountain goat, her legs and muscles accustomed to the harsh terrain, while Gabriel staggered, struggling to keep pace. The snow piled up higher, the wind howling with such intensity that it felt like a living thing, clawing at their skin and threatening to throw them off the path. Gabriel's breath came in shallow gasps. His legs were heavy with exhaustion, and the cold began to seep deeper into his bones. He could hardly keep his eyes open as the wind slapped at his face, the snow blurring everything in sight. He glanced up only to see Min moving forward, her figure growing smaller with each step she took. "Don't let go," Min's voice came, sharp and clear through the chaos of the storm. "Hold the rope tight." He nodded weakly, trying to focus, but the storm was relentless. Every time he slipped, the rope tugged, pulling him back to the trail. There was no stopping, no turning back. He couldn't afford to. It wasn't until they reached the first cluster of homes that Gabriel realized just how bad things had gotten. The storm had already ravaged the town, leaving behind nothing but the wreckage of roofs that had caved in under the weight of the snow, broken windows and piles of shattered timber. The streets were empty, eerily silent, save for the sounds of snow and wind. And in that silence, Gabriel's heart sank. The people of Granite Hollow were huddled together in the saloon, their faces pale and drawn with fear. The fire that had once been the source of warmth was now reduced to a pile of glowing embers, struggling to stay alive. They had already endured the worst of it, the houses destroyed, the fires suffocating, the snow piling up, but there was still more to come. The storm was far from over. Min didn't stop. She didn't wait for Gabriel to catch up. She moved straight into the saloon, her eyes scanning the room, the crowd of people shrinking back as she entered. For a moment there was complete silence. The townspeople stared at her, their faces a mixture of disbelief and shame. This woman who they had mocked was standing here alive while their homes lay in ruin. Gabriel entered behind her, shaking with exhaustion and cold, but when he stepped into the saloon, something in the room shifted. The warm glow of Min's lantern illuminated the faces of the townspeople, and Gabriel saw something new in their eyes. There was no mocking now, no pity, only a growing sense of awe and humility. Min didn't waste time. She immediately began to organize the group, issuing orders with quiet authority. "Tie the rope to your waists," she commanded, her voice firm and unyielding. "Children in the middle, do not let go. If you do, the mountain takes you." The men, once so proud and certain of their strength, now looked to her for guidance. Even Barnaby, who had mocked her from the livery stable only days before, stood silently, trembling as he tied the rope to his waist. The women clutched their children, their eyes wide with terror. The wind continued to howl outside, shaking the building to its foundations. But in the saloon, there was only the sound of hurried movements as the townspeople obeyed Min's orders. Gabriel watched, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over him. Min wasn't just a survivor, she was the leader, the one who had the wisdom and the strength to pull them through this storm. She was no longer the odd woman living in a cave. She was the one holding them together, the one who understood how to survive when the world around them was breaking apart. With a final glance at the townspeople, Min turned toward the door, ready to lead them out into the storm. "We move now," she said. "Stay close, don't let go." Gabriel, his body numb from the cold but filled with a newfound respect for the woman who had saved them all, nodded. And with that, they stepped back out into the storm, following the only beacon of light they had left. The storm didn't relent. The winds howled like an untamable beast, tearing through the town with violent force. Each gust of icy wind cut at the skin, scraping away any warmth that had once been carried in the bones. The people of Granite Hollow had no choice but to follow Min, their lives tethered to the woman who had lived alone in the mountain, mocked by all, and yet now their only hope. Min moved ahead, her feet sure on the snow-slicked path. Despite the raging storm, she was unshaken. Gabriel, stumbling behind her, couldn't help but wonder how she had become so in tune with the earth, with the mountain. Every step she took seemed deliberate, guided by a knowledge of the land that he couldn't hope to understand. The rope between them felt like a lifeline, and as they trudged through the snow, he found himself relying on it more and more. He couldn't afford to let go. The townspeople were not so strong, not so accustomed to the relentless grind of survival. Barnaby, the loudmouth, grunted with every step, his face pale, his breath ragged as he tried to keep up. Mrs. Gable clutched her grandchild tightly, the small body wrapped in a bundle of blankets, her face streaked with tears. The wind was so fierce that it seemed to tear the world apart, but Min didn't flinch. She pressed on, her body cutting through the snow like a silent blade. Gabriel glanced back at the others. The townspeople were struggling. The elderly were already slowing down, the children clinging to their parents with wide eyes filled with fear. And yet, in the face of it all, Min remained steady. Her movements were precise, her steps sure. She wasn't just leading them through the storm, she was holding them together. It was when they reached the final stretch of the path, the most dangerous part of the journey, that Gabriel realized how truly vulnerable they were. The mountain had become a vast, empty expanse of white, and the only thing that stood between them and the storm was Min. The path was treacherous, the snow deepening by the minute, and the wind threatened to shove them off the edge of the cliffs. The townspeople were no longer laughing. They were too tired, too cold, and too scared to joke anymore. The air tasted bitter, and every step felt like it took everything from them. Gabriel, his muscles aching, was ready to collapse, but Min didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. Her eyes, focused on the path ahead, flickered to Gabriel. She saw the struggle in his face, the exhaustion, but she didn't say anything. There was no need for words. She simply reached down and pulled the rope taut, giving it a gentle tug. Gabriel, despite his exhaustion, felt a spark of strength surge through him. He was tied to her, to the mountain, and they would make it through this together. Behind them, the wind continued to howl. But as they made their way up the last stretch, the townspeople, once so proud, followed her without question. Min had proven to them what they had never understood. Strength did not come from the warmth of walls, but from the determination to endure, to stay alive even when the world seemed determined to bury you. They finally reached the mine's entrance, the large, heavy doors a sanctuary in the chaos. Min moved quickly, untying the rope from around her waist and pulling it through the looped knots. Gabriel, feeling like his limbs would give out beneath him, staggered into the warmth of the mine. The heat from the thermal vents hit him like a wave, but it wasn't just the warmth that overwhelmed him. It was the relief, the comfort of knowing they had made it. The others stumbled in after him, their faces raw from the cold, their hands numb, their bodies shivering. They were huddled together in silence, their exhaustion evident, but there was something else too, something that wasn't there before. They were no longer mocking Min. They no longer saw her as the strange, isolated widow. They saw her as their savior, the one who had brought them back from the brink. Min didn't look at them. She didn't need to. She simply moved to the stove and began to tend to the fire, adding fresh coal to keep the heat circulating through the chamber. Gabriel sank to the floor, his body too tired to move, but the warmth was already seeping back into his bones. Mrs. Gable, her face pale and drawn, looked up at Min. Her hands, trembling with the cold, wiped away tears that had frozen on her cheeks. You saved us," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "We didn't believe, we didn't understand." Min paused, her back still turned, her hands working methodically around the stove. "The mountain listens," she said quietly. "We only have to listen too." The townspeople sat in silence, gathering their strength. The storm howled outside, but in here, in the heart of the mountain, there was peace. The winds raged, but they were safe. Min didn't give them time to feel pity for themselves. She began to organize the group, handing out blankets and bowls of broth made from the food she had preserved. The smell of warm broth filled the chamber, a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. The people, their faces hollow from hunger and cold, ate quietly, their eyes shifting between Min and the others. Gabriel sat quietly in the corner watching her. He had always known Min was different, but now he saw her for what she truly was, not just a survivor, but a protector. She had no need for their approval, no desire to show them she had been right. She simply did what had to be done, and that was enough. The storm would pass. The town would rebuild, but the lesson they had learned tonight would never fade. Min had saved them, not just by providing shelter, but by showing them the strength that came from surviving the worst the world could throw at you. And as Gabriel watched Min move between the survivors, organizing them, guiding them, he realized that it wasn't the town that had saved them. It was the mountain, and Min had been its faithful steward. The morning after the storm, the town of Granite Hollow was unrecognizable. The landscape, once familiar with its crooked streets and rickety houses, was now a sea of white. The snow had piled so high that it was difficult to discern where the valley ended and the sky began. The town was buried under 10 feet of snow, but in the depths of the Copperhead Drift, the survivors were alive. Min stood at the entrance of the mine, the cold still biting at her skin, but the warmth inside had been enough to keep them all safe. Gabriel was standing beside her, his arms crossed, looking out at the wasteland of their town. His eyes, tired but filled with a quiet respect, scanned the destruction before them. The people of Granite Hollow, once so proud and so sure of their place in the world, now found themselves at a crossroads. Everything they had known, their homes, their businesses, their sense of security, was gone. The storm had shattered everything, leaving only the mine as a sanctuary. They were forced to reckon with the one truth they had always avoided. Survival was not about the walls you built, but the strength you had to endure the storms, both outside and within. Gabriel, still awestruck by Min's quiet strength, turned to her. "We can't stay here forever," he said, his voice heavy with the burden of what lay ahead. "The storm will pass, but the town, it's gone." Min didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She already knew. "The town isn't gone. It's just been reset," she said, her voice steady. "We rebuild, not from what we lost, but from what we have left." Gabriel nodded slowly, understanding. Min wasn't talking about just the physical structures that had been destroyed. She was talking about the strength they had left, the resilience that could only come from having nothing and yet still fighting to survive. Inside the mine, the survivors had begun to stir. The heat from the thermal vents had kept them alive through the night, but now the reality of their situation settled in. They were alive, but they had no homes, no livestock, and only the supplies Min had carefully stockpiled to keep them alive a little longer. Min had already begun to organize. She spoke to the men, the women, and the children with a calm authority that came naturally to her. She didn't coddle them. She didn't offer empty assurances. She simply laid out the next steps, a roadmap to survival that was both simple and hard. "Gabriel," she said, turning to him, "you need to go down into the valley. The first clear day we can begin to dig out. I'll stay here. I'll help the others get the ventilation systems running again, make sure we have enough food for the next few days. You take the others, start clearing the path." Gabriel didn't hesitate. There was no more room for questions or second-guessing. Min had already made her decisions. She was the leader here, and he was more than willing to follow. Over the next few days, they worked together, slowly clearing paths in the snow and trying to salvage what they could from the town. It wasn't easy. It was grueling, back-breaking work. But they didn't stop. The people who had once laughed at Min now found themselves relying on her to survive. She had proven something to them, not just that she could endure, but that she could teach them how to endure, too. As the town began to rebuild, the people who had once shunned Min now approached her with a new respect. They didn't apologize, there was no need for that. But they learned to listen to her, to take her advice. They understood that she was the one who had kept them alive when the storm had tried to take them all. Weeks later, the snow began to melt. The valley slowly began to show signs of life again. The destruction had been immense, but so was the determination to rebuild. Granite Hollow would never be the same. The people who had once mocked men were forever changed by what they had gone through together. The hierarchy had shifted. The man who had been the banker now stood in line behind the man who had repaired wheels. The people who had ridiculed Min's home in the mountain now sought to build their houses with a bit of her knowledge, using thicker timber, stronger materials. One day, as the sun finally pierced through the clouds, Min and Gabriel stood together outside the Copperhead Drift, watching the town take shape again. The wooden houses were going up again, but this time they were sturdier, built with thicker walls and stronger foundations. The people of Granite Hollow had learned that survival wasn't about how you started, but how you endured. Min didn't move down to the valley with the others. She and Gabriel stayed in the mine, expanding it into a new home, half stone, half timber, a place that stood as a bridge between the earth and the sky. They didn't need the town's approval anymore. They didn't need anyone to tell them they were doing it right. They knew. And as the seasons passed, the town of Granite Hollow rose again, stronger and more resilient than before. The people would always remember the winter of the great snowstorm, the one that had buried their homes but not their spirits. They would remember the woman who had lived in the mountain, the one they had mocked but had saved them all. For Min, there was no triumph. There was no victory. There was only survival and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the mountain had shared its warmth and they had listened. The rest of the town would always remember her too, the woman who had walked through fire and ice, who had led them from the brink of death to a new beginning. They would never forget that sometimes it's the outcasts, the ones who have been ignored and dismissed, who hold the answers when the world falls apart. And so life in Granite Hollow continued, stronger, wiser, and above all humble.